At noon on the 31st of March, 1948, a crowd stood on Riverside Drive and waited for a house to come down. The operator in the crane worked a row of hand levers. A steel ball weighing 2 tons swung out and struck the northwest tower. The stone held. Then the second swing opened a hole, about 20 feet down from the top. 2 more blows widened it. On the 5th, the crown of the tower gave way. 5 tons of stone leaned slowly to the north, then dropped into the street inside a cloud of white dust. A reporter from the Times stood in the crowd that day. In his account, the children watching were delighted, and some of the older people were not. What came down that afternoon had covered an entire Manhattan city block. 75 rooms, 50,000 square feet of floor. Lawns and terraced gardens on all 4 sides of it, which no other private residence in this city has ever managed, before or since. Inside there was a chapel with a pipe organ built into it. Down in the cellar sat a power station that fed 6,000 light bulbs. By the time the ball hit it, the place had been standing empty for 9 years. Before he died, the man who built it had tried to give it away. Not sell it. Give it. He offered the whole property to the city of New York for nothing, to be used as an official residence for the mayor, and the mayor turned him down. The man who built it was named Charles Schwab. He started work at 17, carrying survey stakes around a steel mill for $1 a day, which is about $60 now. At the end of his life, he owed more than he owned. Fiorello LaGuardia had no interest in living like a rich man. He grew up on an army post in Arizona and began his working life as an interpreter on Ellis Island. As mayor, he rode out with the fire companies. When the newspaper deliverers went on strike, he read the comics aloud on the radio so the children of the city would not miss them. Short, loud, permanently rumpled, and New York liked him a great deal for it. That is the man Charles Schwab approached with the offer of a free palace. Put that way, the refusal sounds like a matter of temperament. What strikes me is that temperament had very little to do with it. A building of that size is expensive simply to stand still in. By the middle of the 30s, the property taxes alone reportedly ran above $60,000 a year. In today's money, that is close to $1.5 million. The sum bought nothing at all. The figure was simply the annual price of the structure continuing to exist before a single light was switched on or a single room heated. Above that came coal for the private power plant and wages for everyone required to keep the place from rotting. City Hall would have had to find that money every year, out of public funds, in the middle of a depression, so that one elected official could have an address. New York had no official mayoral residence at the time. Mayors lived wherever they had lived before taking office, and the arrangement had never caused anybody much difficulty. Schwab was not solving a problem for anybody. He was handing over a liability and hoping it would be received as a gift. This was not his first attempt to be rid of the place. As early as 1930, a New York paper carried a report that the block had been sold. An apartment building was to go up where the mansion stood. Nothing came of it. Such stories fade when no buyer actually signs. What New York chose instead, some years later, tells you what the place considered reasonable. Gracie Mansion became the mayor's official home in 1942. A wooden country house, put up by a merchant at the end of the 1700s, standing in a public park at the top of the east side. A wide porch runs around it. LaGuardia moved in and stayed. Looking back, that refusal was the last real chance the Riverside house had. Nobody said so at the time. Schwab did not stop trying. When he died in 1939, his will handed the property to the city government anyway. The bequest was declined. Nobody argued about the quality of the building. No official was willing to stand in front of a taxpayer and explain why the municipality should take on the largest private house on the west side. Not in that decade. Title passed to Chase National Bank, which held the property as custodian, and set about finding an occupant. Any occupant. According to a wire report from the last year of the war, the bank offered the house for rent at $75,000 a year. In today's money, that is well over $1 million. It found no tenant. The same report noted, with something close to amusement, that the bank's own spokesman made very little effort to talk the place up. 9 years is a long stretch for a building of that size to sit unoccupied on a public street. A child who started school on West 74th Street the year Schwab died would have been most of the way through it before the crane arrived. The war found a use for parts of the building, although not one anybody had imagined when it was finished. Sections were partitioned into apartments. On the terraced lawns, where gardeners had once kept formal beds and clipped hedges, somebody planted a victory garden and grew vegetables in it. Then, in 1947, the Prudential Insurance Company bought the block. Reported figures for the sale vary and sit somewhere above $1 million. The price matters less than the intention. Prudential wanted the ground. The company said from the outset that the mansion would come down, and apartments would go up in its place. The doors were opened first, so buyers could come in and strip out anything worth carrying away. A house of 75 rooms had stood available for most of a decade to almost anyone willing to live in it. The city would not take it as a gift. No tenant would take it at any rent. In the end, the only serious offer came from a buyer who wanted the dirt underneath. $865,000. That is what Charles Schwab paid in 1901 for a piece of ground on the west side of Manhattan. Call it $36 million in today's money. Newspapers reported it at the time as the largest sum ever paid for a building lot in New York, and nobody seems to have stood up to contradict them. The money bought a full square of the street grid. Riverside Drive on the western edge, West End Avenue on the eastern, 73rd Street to the south and 74th to the north. 4 street frontages, no neighbors sharing a wall because there would be no walls to share. Before Schwab owned it, that ground belonged to orphans. The Orphan Asylum Society had moved out to that spot in 1839 when the district was called Bloomingdale and lay roughly 5 miles north of the city proper. Farmland, mostly, with a scattering of small estates and a good deal of quiet. What the society wanted was distance from the crowding and the fevers downtown. Distance was what it got. Looking for what stood there before the mansion did, I came across a set of figures from the Society's own annual report in the 1870s. 188 boys and girls were living there that year, down from 217 the year before. The budget came to about $37,000, a little over $1 million now. That paid for everything: clothing, bedding, fuel, the laundry, the doctor, and the wages of the teachers and matrons who looked after them. 60 years of that on the same ground, and then the city caught up and surrounded the place. The society moved on to Westchester, and the land went on the market. It did not all go to Schwab. The society's holding ran further east, and on the Broadway frontage another buyer put up the Ansonia, an enormous apartment hotel that is standing there still. Remember that. 2 halves of one orphanage were sold within a few years of each other. One became a building full of apartments. The other became a house for 2 people. The first man to buy Schwab's half was Jacob Schiff. Schiff was a banker at Kuhn, Loeb & Company, rich enough to build whatever he liked, wherever he liked. He bought the ground. Then he did not build on it. According to the account that has come down, his wife refused to make the move. If she went to live out on the drive, she said, she would never see her friends again. So Schiff sold the land on, and the buyer was Charles Schwab. Then that conversation happened a second time, in a different household. Rana Schwab did not want to go either, and her reasoning ran along identical lines. Her friends were on the east side of the park. She believed that crossing it would cost her every one of them. Her husband signed for it anyway. Wrong is a word worth unpacking here, because this was not only snobbery about an address. Central Park functioned as a wall. Society had settled along its eastern edge and had no particular reason to cross. The Fifth Avenue houses stood close enough together to be within calling distance, and the entire machinery of visiting cards and afternoon calls depended on that closeness. Move a mile west, and you were not merely inconvenient. You were out of the system. The West Side carried its own difficulties. An elevated railway ran up Ninth Avenue, dropping noise and soot on everything underneath it. Below Riverside Park, on the Hudson shore, the New York Central ran freight at ground level. The Riverview Schwab paid a record price for came with a working railway at the bottom of it. None of this was secret, and the developers had an answer ready. Riverside Drive was going to be the next avenue of the rich. The Hudson was wider and finer than anything the far side of the park could offer, and the ground was cheap enough to build properly on. A handful of wealthy men believed it and put up freestanding houses along the drive. Schwab believed it harder than any of them and paid accordingly. They were wrong. The migration never came. Fifth Avenue stayed Fifth Avenue, and the families who mattered stayed on it. Something else arrived on Riverside Drive instead. When it did, it made a single house on a whole city block look like an error that could be counted in dollars. All of that was still some years off. In 1901, there was nothing on that ground but a record price and two women who had already called it a mistake. You went in through bronze, and there were two sets of bronze doors, one on the Riverside Drive side facing the Hudson, another opening onto 74th Street at the back. Each leaf weighed somewhere between a ton and a ton and a half. When the New York Times described them before the work was finished, the paper reached for a comparison and settled on the bronze doors of the Capitol in Washington. Schwab's would be slightly smaller, it noted. That is the frame of reference, not other houses on the drive and not the palaces across the park, a seat of national government. It took me longer than it should have to accept that nobody actually knows how many rooms were behind those doors. Newspapers of the day, later architectural histories, and the sale notices at the end give figures anywhere from 40 to 86. The number that appears most often is 75. That figure may well be wrong. A house nobody could count seems worth mentioning out loud. Here is what is not in dispute. 4 stories and a footprint that ran the full width of the property. At the heart of the plan stood a chapel, 2 stories high and large enough to seat a full orchestra. It served as a music room whenever nobody was praying in it. A pipe organ had been made for that space and fitted into the fabric of it. Schwab was not satisfied. In 1904, he had the instrument enlarged, at a cost of $21,500. 7 years later, he had it enlarged a second time, and that job came to $23,457.50. The 50 cents is the best detail in this whole story. Somebody itemized that bill down to the $half, and somebody else paid it without argument. Each enlargement would run to close to $800,000 in today's money. He spent roughly the same sum twice, 7 years apart, on an instrument he already owned. And that was not the only one in the building. A second organ was installed at the main staircase, so that music met you on the way up. Underneath all of this was a natatorium, which is the period word for an indoor swimming pool. 20 feet by 30, lined in glazed brick, roofed in glass. On the same level lay a gymnasium 50 feet long, and beside it, a bowling alley. Electricity came from the property itself. A generating plant in the cellar carried the entire load, the lamps and the 3 elevators, and a system for cooling the air in summer. Sit with that last one for a moment. Air conditioning in a private residence in 1906. 3 decades later, Schwab was still bringing it up in conversation, which tells you he understood exactly how far ahead of everybody he had been on at least one thing. Deliveries never crossed the lawn. A service tunnel ran beneath the gardens so that coal and groceries could reach the house unseen. On the grounds there was a lodge kept purely for receiving goods. The garage held 4 motor cars, at a moment when most of New York still moved by horse. The rooms were done as a kind of museum of dead European monarchy, a different reign in each. Dinner was eaten under Louis XIV. Henri II took the library, which reproduced the one at Fontainebleau. Francis I was given the main hall. As for the parlor, that was worked up from the Petit Trianon at Versailles, which is to say from the private retreat Marie Antoinette used to escape her own court. Pillars of marble, carved rather than cast, paneling in South American mahogany, A picture gallery holding art worth something in the region of $55 million in today's money. Then, upstairs, the room the owner actually slept in measured 20 feet on a side, with a shower stall in the bathroom 5 feet square. That is not small. In a building of this scale, it is nearly restrained. Of every measurement in the inventory, it is the only one that sounds as though it belongs to a person rather than an institution. When the Times finally passed judgment on the finished work, the word it landed on was pretentious. The paper did not intend an insult. The point was that this structure made a claim, and that the claim was the biggest anybody in the city had yet attempted. One thing to hold on to before we leave the chapel: the organ was not furniture. It had been built into the structure of that room, cut to fit it and nothing else. 42 years later, that was going to become somebody's problem. Nobody in that room knew who he was. That is barely an exaggeration. On the evening of the 12th of December, 1900, some 80 men sat down to dinner at the University Club in New York. Chauncey Depew and Edward Harriman were there for the railroads. So were the bankers James Stillman and August Belmont, and Henry Rogers of Standard Oil. Between them, they held a meaningful share of the wealth of the United States. Their guest of honor was 38 years old and ran Carnegie Steel, which made him about as important as an industrial manager could be. Outside the mills, almost nobody at that table could have placed his face. One of the bankers present was Jacob Schiff, who around this time owned a vacant block on Riverside Drive that his wife would not live on. The dinner had been given by J. Edward Simmons of the Fourth National Bank, returning hospitality shown to him on a visit to Pittsburgh. Simmons had gathered his own circle to come and meet this young man from the steel country. Seated on Schwab's right was John Pierpont Morgan. At 63, Morgan was at the height of everything he could do. He disliked competition the way some men dislike noise. Price wars struck him as a failure of manners as much as a failure of economics. He had spent years buying companies for the specific purpose of stopping them fighting each other. Then Schwab stood up and spoke without notes. His subject was the future of steel, and his argument was consolidation. A single company holding the best mills in America could run each one for what it was actually good at. No more having all of them make a little of everything. Waste would go. Price wars would end. What was left would be large enough to take on Europe and win. Accounts of how long he talked run from half an hour to an hour and a half. Every version agrees on one thing. Morgan, who had a cigar in his hand throughout, never lit it. When it was over, Morgan took him aside. Through January, the two of them worked on it, mostly at Morgan's house on Madison Avenue. The library there was where he preferred to conduct business he did not want overheard. There was at least one session that ran all night, with a Morgan partner named Robert Bacon, and a speculator called John Gates. None of this had been mentioned to his employer. Sit with that for a second. Here was the president of Carnegie Steel negotiating in private with the one man capable of buying Carnegie Steel, and Andrew Carnegie had not been informed. When he finally did raise it, he raised it on a golf course. Carnegie kept a cottage by the links at St. Andrews in Westchester. Schwab went up and played around with him, then asked what figure would move him. The older man thought it over and wrote a number on a sheet of paper. Morgan looked at the sheet and accepted without haggling. If you want one evening that explains the house on Riverside Drive, I would give you this one. The number on that paper was around $492 million. More than $20 billion in today's money, handed to one man and his partners for one business. United States Steel was incorporated in February of 1901, assembled out of 10 separate companies, with an authorized capitalization of $1.4 billion. It was the first billion-dollar corporation in the history of the world. That figure is hard to feel, so here is a comparison. In the same year, the entire federal government of the United States spent $517 million. The Army and the Navy, the courts and the post offices, all of it. The new steel company was capitalized at nearly 3 times the annual cost of running the country. Charles Schwab was made its first president at 38. He became famous inside a week. The trade press had known his name for years. Now the general papers knew it, and so did every man who read a headline about the largest company ever put together. What the headlines did not carry was that the job was smaller than it appeared. Elbert Gary held the chairmanship, and the board held the power. Schwab ran the mills. The decisions that mattered were taken somewhere he was not sitting. Reports of what he was paid range from $300,000 a year up to $2 million. Whatever the true figure, it was enough. He went out past Central Park that same year and bought a whole block of the island. It ran in the right-hand column of the New York Sun, and it was not long. Datelined Monte Carlo, the 12th of January, 1902. Charles Schwab, president of the United States Steel Corporation, had been playing roulette very high for several days. That afternoon, he broke the bank. The number was 26, backed in the maximums and in various combinations, and it produced 50,000 francs. Amid some excitement, a crowd followed him out of the room. That was the whole story, a few lines of small print. A stockholder named William Dodge came across it over breakfast the next morning, and by the end of the week half of America had seen it too. Now, it is difficult to reconstruct how that landed at the time. For a very large number of Americans, gambling was not a vice or a weakness. Gambling was a sin. Money staked on a wheel was money thrown at nothing, which was not what money was for. People who gambled were assumed to be the sort of people who would also lie to you and take what was yours. Layered on top of that sat a practical question with teeth. United States Steel had just been floated. Ordinary Americans had bought shares in it. Would you leave your savings with a corporation whose president spent his evenings at a roulette table in a foreign casino? The man who took it hardest was Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie had come out of a strict Presbyterian household in Dunfermline, a family with no patience for waste of any kind and none whatever for gambling. The work of his life was sold. What remained of his years was going to be spent handing the proceeds away. On purpose. And now the young man he had lifted out of a Pennsylvania steel mill was in the papers, throwing money at a wheel in Monaco. The cable he sent Schwab was short, and it was brutal. Public sentiment was shocked. The papers were demanding a denial. There would probably have to be a resignation. And it served him right. To Morgan, Carnegie wrote separately and at greater length. A son had disgraced the family was how he framed it. Nothing had wounded him so deeply in a long while. Whatever the younger man's talents, and Carnegie granted they were considerable, he was not fit to head the corporation. Schwab's account of the trip was a different story altogether. By his telling, there had been a motoring tour through the south of France with a party of friends. The casino, yes. He had gone in because he liked the orchestra. The sensational reports were false, and on no occasion had he won more than $36. The arithmetic here troubles me. 50,000 francs came to somewhere near $10,000 in the money of the day. $36 is not a modest version of that. Those two accounts are not describing the same evening. No arrangement of the facts lets both of them stand. Morgan said nothing in public. His private position was that what a man did with his own evenings was his own affair, and Schwab stayed in post for the time being. That counted for something. What it could not do was recover the loss, because Carnegie never came back. The correspondence dried up. A friendship that had carried a grocery clerk to the head of American industry did not resume for years. It would be tidy to say the casino ended his career, and a good many retellings say exactly that. The record is less obliging. Schwab also talked too much in public, and said things that read badly in print. Audiences were told that a college education was not necessary for success in business, which offended a great many educated people. Trade unions, he said, held back economic growth, which offended a great many others. More seriously, he had used his own money to buy a small steel company in Pennsylvania, then folded it into a shipbuilding venture that ran into trouble. The board of the corporation he was supposed to be running took a dim view of its president owning a competitor on the side. His health broke. A long rest abroad followed. In August of 1903, the presidency was handed back. The top job at the first billion-dollar company on Earth had lasted him about 2.5 years. 4 miles north of Wall Street, on the block he had bought with the proceeds, the foundations of the house were already in the ground. The job was called stake driver. It meant carrying the rods and marker stakes for the survey crews who laid out where new furnaces and mill extensions were going to stand. You walked where you were sent and held the rod steady while somebody more important looked at it through a glass. Then you moved and did it again. Summer of 1879. Charles Schwab was 17, and the wage was $1 a day. Williamsburg, Pennsylvania, was where he had been born, in February of 1862. The family moved to Loretto after his father bought the town's livery stable. Loretto sits up in the Allegheny Hills, small then and small now. High school was finished there, and that was the end of his formal education. 70 miles west lay Braddock, and Andrew Carnegie's Edgar Thompson works on the Monongahela. The boy went and took a job clerking in a store for $10 a month. 12-hour days behind the counter with the bookkeeping on top. One of the regular customers came in for cigars. Captain Bill Jones ran the Edgar Thompson Works and was, without much argument, the king of Braddock. Apprenticed at 10 as a foundry molder, Union Army afterwards, which is where the captain came from. Under his hand, that mill had become the most productive rail works in the world, and his employer knew precisely what he had in him. The cigars kept coming with conversation attached. Eventually, Jones asked whether the boy wanted work at the mill. One further thing connected the two men, and it turned out to matter more than any of the rest. Both cared about music. Jones began using his new hire as a messenger to Carnegie. One afternoon the message could not be delivered because the owner of the mills was not yet home. Left waiting in the house, the boy sat down at the parlor piano and started to play. Carnegie came in, and rather than stopping him, told him to carry on. The Scot loved Scottish tunes above all others. He asked whether the young man could play his favorites at a party in 3 days' time. Schwab did not know a single one of them. There is a detail in that story I find more useful than any balance sheet in this film. He said yes. Then he learned the music inside 3 days and played it. Not well enough to be forgiven. Well enough to be remembered. After that, things moved. At 23, a bridge over the railroad tracks was handed to him to design and build. The work came in under the schedule and under the budget. Carnegie sent 10 $20 gold pieces as a bonus. When a customer complained about the quality of Carnegie rails, the young superintendent set up a chemistry laboratory in his own kitchen. Working from books, he taught himself the metallurgy that almost nobody in the industry properly understood yet. In 1887, a British steelmaker offered $50,000 a year to come and run works in Birmingham. He turned it down because the offer did not extend to the men working under him. 2 years later, the captain was killed in an accident at the furnaces, and Schwab took over the mill. 3 years after that came Homestead. The lockout at the Homestead Works in 1892 turned violent, and it ended with the union broken and men dead on both sides. Carnegie sent Schwab in afterwards to run what was left of it. Schwab moved into the plant and stayed there, walking every part of it at all hours. The task in front of him was winning back a workforce with every reason to hate the company. His method was not complicated. Talk to people. Pay a bonus for quality rather than for volume. By 1900, Homestead was the largest steel plant on Earth. The presidency of Carnegie Steel came at 35. Something else happened in those Braddock years. In 1883, he married Emma Urana Dinky, whose family kept the boarding house he had been lodging in. Everybody called her Rana. Their first house together stood on Jones Avenue in Braddock, named for the captain, and it is still there today. The place looks like exactly what it was, a decent house belonging to a young man doing well in a mill town. Nothing about it predicts what came next. Why would you hire a nobody? The question is not rhetorical. Of every decision in this story, it is the strangest, and nobody has ever explained it properly. Consider what the other steel money did. Andrew Carnegie put his house up on Fifth Avenue at 91st Street and used an established New York firm to do it. Henry Clay Frick built at 70th Street and hired Carrere and Hastings, the practice that had just produced the New York Public Library. When a man of that class built in Manhattan, he bought a reputation along with the drawings. The architect's name was part of what the house was saying. Schwab hired Maurice Hebert. Hebert was French and competent and almost entirely unknown outside a small professional circle. On his own trade card, he described himself as a specialist in the reproduction of historical exteriors and classical interiors. That is a fair description of a copyist rather than a designer. This was the man handed the largest private commission in the city. My own guess is that Schwab did not want an architect with opinions. He already knew what he wanted in detail, down to which specific buildings in France he wanted quoted. What he needed was somebody who would execute the thing rather than argue about it. It is the same instinct that had hired him out of a grocery store 30 years earlier. Judge the man in front of you. Ignore what other people think of the name. So, which buildings? The front of the house came from Chenonceau. The exterior staircase was lifted from Blois. Azay-le-Rideau supplied a further set of elements alongside them. Those are 3 real chateaux, standing today in the Loire Valley in France, put up in the 1500s for kings and for the people who served them. Chenonceau is the one that bridges a river. Blois has the spiral stair that everybody photographs. Azay-le-Rideau sits in its own water. Notice what that means. Schwab was not building in the French Renaissance manner, the way 100 American houses of the period did. He was ordering specific quotations from specific buildings and expecting the citation to be recognized. Before a single stone was cut, the entire design was modeled in wax. The model cost $20,000, or roughly $750,000 in today's money. Somebody built a wax house so that a man could walk around it and decide whether he liked the real one. Then the actual work began, and the scale of it is easier to convey through the arrangements than through adjectives. A quarry was opened at Peekskill up the Hudson to supply this one building and nothing else. Accounts of the finished surface disagree, some describing pink granite and others limestone, and it may well have been more than one material. What nobody disputes is the volume required. More than 100 artists and modelers and engineers were engaged on the project, along with a drawing office of their own. Hebert went in person to the workshops of William Baumgarten and Company to supervise the weaving of reproduction tapestries. Several of those tapestries were considered good enough to hang at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904 before they were taken down and installed in the house. The Times reported the governing rule of the job: no stock material anywhere in the building, however good the stock material happened to be. Made to order, all of it, and made once. Work started in the spring of 1902. The original plan had the family moving in by Christmas of 1904, at a projected cost of $2.5 million. Neither of those held. The building was finished 2 years late, and the final figure has never been pinned down closer than somewhere between 6 and 10 million. One last thing about the timing. The presidency of United States Steel had been handed back the previous summer. The job that paid for all of this was 3 years gone before anybody moved in. The shape is a capital letter H. Turn it on its side and you have the cross-section of a steel beam. 2 parallel flanges with a web running between them. The whole thing rolled out of one piece of hot metal in a single pass, rather than riveted together from separate plates by men with hammers. That object is the most consequential thing in this entire story, and it is not the house. A beam of that section carries far more load for its weight than anything that came before it. It goes up faster because there is less to assemble on site, and it behaves more predictably, because a rolled shape has none of the weak points riveting introduces. Give an engineer that beam, and he can put a floor above a floor above a floor, and keep going considerably higher than he could the week before. Bethlehem Steel made it in America. That was the small Pennsylvania firm Schwab had bought with his own money. The private purchase that had helped cost him the presidency. Freed of that job, he turned his full attention to the mills he actually owned. A rolling mill of a new kind went in, and the works began turning out wide flange sections at scale. Within a few years, the company was the largest supplier of structural steel to the American construction industry and the second largest steel producer in the country. For the next quarter of a century, when a tall building went up in New York, the bones of it were very often his. Then came the war, and Bethlehem became something else again. Late in 1914, the British Admiralty needed submarines and needed them quickly. 20 of them. British yards had quoted 15 months. Schwab offered 9 and put his own money behind it by accepting a financial penalty if he missed the date. American neutrality law then made the delivery illegal. His answer was to build the components in the United States, ship them north, and assemble them at a British-owned yard in Montreal. Winston Churchill, who had first called him a cheat over the arrangement, spent the rest of his life admiring him. In April of 1918, President Wilson put him in charge of the Emergency Fleet Corporation, which meant authority over every shipyard in the United States. He tore up the cost-plus contracts the industry had been living on and replaced them with fixed prices. Afterwards, the accusation came. Bethlehem and its chairman were described as merchants of death, profiteers who had grown fat on a war. The charges went to the courts, and the courts rejected them. Now here is the part that nobody planned. A beam that lets you build 15 stories does not only change what a building looks like, it changes what the ground underneath is worth. Think about a Manhattan block as an arithmetic problem, where the best you can put on it is one house. Its value is capped by what a single wealthy family will pay to live there. Fit 600 apartments onto the same ground, and the value is set by 6. 100 rents, collected every month for as long as the building stands. Those two numbers are not close, and the gap between them widens every single year. The consequences arrived on Fifth Avenue first. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had built the largest private residence New York has ever seen, running the whole block front from 57th to 58th Street. Something like 130 rooms against Schwab's 75. In 1926, it was pulled down, and a department store took the site. The rest of the avenue followed through that decade and the next. House after house came down, and taller things replaced them. On Riverside Drive it had already started. 24 apartment blocks stood along the drive by 1910, and more kept coming. And on the far half of the orphanage land, the piece Schwab had not bought, the Ansonia had been standing since before his own roof was finished. The causation deserves care here because it was not one thing. Income tax arrived in 1913. Domestic servants became difficult to find and expensive to keep. The Depression finished off what was left. But the beam is the part he made himself. Nowhere in the record have I found any sign that he saw the connection. He was proud of those mills until the day he died, and he was entitled to be. His works were rolling the steel that made his own house impossible. For a while in the early 1930s, on Wednesday evenings you could hear that chapel on the radio. The National Broadcasting Company carried a series of organ recitals played live from inside the house. A farmer in Nebraska with a set in his parlor could sit and listen to. Music coming out of a room he would never see. He could not have pictured it if he tried. The man at the console was S. Archer Gibson. Gibson was not a guest artist brought in for the occasion. He was on the payroll. Schwab kept a private organist on a salary of $10,000 a year, well over $300,000 in today's money. The point was to have somebody always on hand to play the chapel instrument. There is a recording of Gibson at that organ made in 1921, which places it among the earliest organ recordings made anywhere. He was one of a household staff of about 20. A census taker came round in 1930 and wrote down the servants living in the building. Most of them had been born in England, which was the arrangement wealthy Americans of that period considered correct. Among them was the butler George Stone, who had been there for years and who would stay. 20 people to keep one building running for a family of 2. Consider what that actually involved. Coal moved every day. Rooms opened and aired and closed again, most of them for nobody. Silver counted. Meals prepared in kitchens, sized for entertaining on a scale that only occasionally happened. In 1916, the couple sent out a Christmas card, and the picture they chose to put on it was their own staircase. Which brings us back to the woman who had not wanted to come here. Rana Schwab lost that argument, as we have seen. What she did afterwards is the genuinely surprising part. She took the interiors over. Working room by room, she oversaw the design of a house she had said she did not want. She did it thoroughly enough that contemporaries credited the choices to her rather than to her husband. I noticed that almost everything we know about her comes from other people's descriptions. She left very little in her own voice. What survives is a set of observations by visitors and journalists and the people who worked for her. That is not enough to build a confident picture on. Over the years, this much is clear. She went out less and less. Her health declined, invitations kept arriving and she stopped accepting them, and in the end that included invitations from the White House. Friends from across the park did come over to see her, which was more than she had expected when she was arguing against the move. But the traffic ran one way. She received, and increasingly she did not go. George Stone was close by through all of it. Her husband's life ran in the opposite direction entirely. Charles Schwab was the most sociable man in American heavy industry, and everybody who dealt with him said so. The Atlantic got crossed constantly. Anybody got talked to. His weeks ran through dinners and plants and meetings, through hotels in London and Paris and Pittsburgh. The house filled up when he was in it and went quiet when he was not, and he was not a great deal of the time. There is one striking exception to the inwardness of that place, and it came in wartime. In 1917, with American troops going to France, Rana Schwab gave over 2 rooms on the ground floor to Red Cross volunteers. Women came in and worked in them, knitting socks and rolling bandages for soldiers who would never know where any of it had come from. For a period, 2 rooms of a French chateau on the Hudson were a workroom. The couple had no children. So the picture is this: 75 rooms and a staff of 20. A chapel with 2 organs in it, one of them going out live to the entire country on a Wednesday night. And at the center of the arrangement, a woman who had stopped going out of the front door. He was still being paid $250,000 a year at the point when he could not pay his taxes. That is not a contradiction invented afterwards. His salary as chairman ran to $250,000. Call it $6 million in modern terms. It arrived every year, straight through the worst of it. To measure a fall, you need the height it started from. In 1918, when Forbes published the first list of the richest men in America, Charles Schwab came in 13th, with an estimated fortune of $70 million. Adjusted forward, that is something over $1 billion. On the same rung of the list sat a Guggenheim and the son of J.P. Morgan. Income is not wealth, and the difference has rarely been illustrated more clearly. His fortune was not sitting in a vault, it was in Bethlehem stock, in other people's ventures, and in property. When the market went in October of 1929, the paper value of the first went with it. Several of the investments turned out to have been poor ones, including money placed in Death Valley mining. What did not move at all was the outgoing side of the ledger. The company was in trouble too, and for a reason that runs straight back through this story. Bethlehem sold structural steel, and in a depression nobody builds. The works that had framed the tall buildings of the 20s watched the orders stop coming. Consider what he was carrying. The house on the drive, a second estate out at Loretto with its own golf course, staff in both places, a private railway car, and the giving, which was constant and largely unrecorded, to old colleagues and relatives and people who had simply written to him. For 50 years the arithmetic had worked because more money always turned up. Nobody had ever had to tell Charles Schwab that this was the last of it. By 1933, the taxes on the Riverside property were going unpaid. I would put the worst moment not at the crash, though, but in a meeting room 2 years after that. Bethlehem Steel held its annual meeting in 1935, and a small stockholder named Mary Gallagher rose to speak. Her point was straightforward. The old man was no longer of use to the company and ought to retire. 73 years old and sitting right there in the room. This was the man who had built the firm out of almost nothing and put the beams into half the skyline of New York. In a war, American shipbuilding had been handed to him personally. Now a shareholder with a modest holding stood up in a room and said in public that he was finished. 2 years later, at another annual meeting, a different shareholder went further and proposed that the salary be cut or stopped altogether. By the accounts that survive, the executives present were shaken by it. Around this same period, the house went on the market at $4 million. That is about $95 million now, and it was a fraction of what had gone into building the thing. Nobody came forward. Not at $4 million, not at anything. Rana Schwab died in January of 1939. She was 79, and she had lived in that house for 33 years, most of them without going out of it much. Her husband left within weeks, and never went back. Rooms were taken in an apartment hotel at 290 Park Avenue, which is a perfectly respectable address and an entirely ordinary one, after a lifetime of bronze doors, a rented flat in Midtown. There is one more detail from those last months, and it is the one that reads worst. For years, money had gone out from him to old friends, to relatives, to men he had worked alongside decades earlier in Pennsylvania. Those payments now had to be reduced. People who knew him at the end said this was the part he took hardest, harder than the house and harder than the meetings. He died on the 18th of September, 1939, of heart disease, 8 months after his wife. The address was a rented apartment less than 2 miles from a house he still owned. An old automobile went for $20. A set of carpenter's tools went for $4. When I came across those two figures in the estate papers, I read them again to be sure. $20 is roughly $450 in modern money. $4 is about $90. Both were sold at an administrator's sale, which is the process by which what a dead man owned is turned into cash to pay what a dead man owed. Those lines belong to the Pennsylvania half of the estate. Here's the rest of it. A preliminary accounting of the New York estate listed debts of just over $2.25 million owed chiefly to banks. Against that stood assets of $353,000. Translated forward, better than $50 million owing, and around $8 million to meet it with. The Pennsylvania filing showed $300,000 in debts against $51,000 in assets, roughly $7 million against a little over $1 million. Owed chiefly to banks is the phrase carrying the weight in all of that. He had been borrowing against what he owned in order to keep going, which is what people do when they are confident the situation is temporary. The man who had put United States Steel together died owing more than he could cover. There were 2 executors, one of them was his younger brother. They had a decision to make about the Bethlehem stock, which was the largest thing left. Markets were low. One of the 2 wanted it sold at once before the price could slide any further. His co-executor, the brother, argued against. Caution won, and the shares went. You can probably see where this is going. Inside 3 years, the mills and the yards were taking orders as fast as anyone could write them, because the country was at war again, and Bethlehem built ships. The price climbed. Had those 2 executors sat still and done absolutely nothing, the estate would have come out solvent. That accounting with the carpenter's tools on it would never have needed filing. Out at Loretto, the second house went the same way. Immergren had 44 rooms and a golf course of its own, on land that had once run to 1,000 acres. It was auctioned in 1942. One bidder appeared. The building and 240 acres around it changed hands for $32,500. Call it $650,000 today. It became a Franciscan friary, and it is still standing, part of a college campus up in the hills where he was raised. A few miles from it, in the cemetery there, stands a private mausoleum. He and Rana are both inside it. Of everything he built or bought or was handed in 77 years, that is the only piece still doing the job he intended it for, which leaves the block on Riverside Drive, and one afternoon in 1947. Prudential had bought the property by then and had thrown the doors open so buyers could come through and carry off anything worth having. Bronze fittings, stained glass, paneling and marble and carved doors. Around 100 people walked those rooms that day, most of them there to look at hardware and work out what it might fetch. S. Archer Gibson was among them. By 1947, the organist was an old man, and he had not come to buy a thing. He went through to the chapel where the instrument he had played for years still stood in the space it had been built to fit. Then he put his hand on the cabinet. Nobody wrote down what he said, if he said anything at all. The organ could not be got out. It had been cut to fit that chapel and nothing else, which is exactly why it sounded the way it did. Now the wrecking company announced that it would come down with the walls. There was no practical alternative. The instrument was part of the building. Then, at close to the last possible hour, a man named Eric Sexton drove down from New Canaan in Connecticut and bought it. Sexton had it taken apart piece by piece and carried out of the chapel. Part of that organ went into a house in Camden, Maine, where it went on being played by somebody who wanted to hear it. A few other things survived. The mahogany doors and some of the carved marble went across the river to Our Lady of Lebanon Cathedral in Brooklyn. They are still there. You can walk in and put your hand on them, which is more than can be said for the rest of it. Everything else came down through the spring of 1948. By 1950, there was a new building on that block. 19 stories of red brick and 636 apartments. The sort of structure that gets described as practical because nobody can think of anything else to say about it. Families moved in. Some of their grandchildren live there now. 3 great steel fortunes built houses in Manhattan. Consider what became of the other 2. Andrew Carnegie's place on Fifth Avenue is the Cooper Hewitt Museum, and anybody can walk through it on a Tuesday afternoon. Henry Clay Frick's is the Frick Collection, and people queue to get into it. Both of those buildings are still doing something. Schwab's became apartments. For my money, the reason is the one difference between the 3 men that nobody thinks to mention. Carnegie handed his house over. Frick planned from the beginning that his would end up a museum with his pictures in it. Schwab wanted a home. He said so repeatedly, and he meant it. The intention was to stay until he died. He is the only one of the 3 who got precisely what he asked for. It stayed a home right up until it was nothing at all. That turned out to be the one thing a Manhattan block cannot go on being. Nobody seems to have argued much about the name of the new building. They called it the Schwab House.